General Hospital spoilers tease that the weight of Sasha's spiraling obsession was becoming unbearable, heavy like chains wrapped tightly around her mind and soul, suffocating her with every breath. Ever since the evidence surfaced confirming that it was Nelle who had crept into the nursery, stolen Daisy from her crib, and vanished into the night, Sasha had been unraveling from the inside out. She no longer slept without nightmares, and even in daylight, she flinched at every sound. Her world had become a distorted mirror of fear and self-blame. The confirmation that Nelle, long presumed dead and buried in the past, was not only alive but stalking her child, shattered Sasha's grip on stability. She had once dismissed her instincts, believing the missing pacifier, the changed onesie, and the unsettling silences were just symptoms of exhaustion. But now, with the proof in her hands, camera footage she never even knew existed, a blurry silhouette matching Nelle's frame, a fingerprint on Daisy's bottle, Sasha was drowning in the horrifying clarity of truth. Nelle had been inside her home, inside her sanctuary. And she hadn't just stolen Daisy, she had stolen Sasha's peace, her trust in the world, and her ability to believe she could protect her daughter. It was more than a break-in. It was an attack on her identity as a mother. And what made the obsession consume her even more was the realization that this wasn't random. It was personal. It was deliberate. It was Nelle's way of saying, "I'm back," without ever uttering a word. The silence of the act screamed louder than any threat. Sasha knew now that Nelle hadn't just targeted Daisy as a helpless infant, she had targeted Sasha as a woman who had rebuilt her life with Michael. A woman who had dared to believe she could be happy again after so much loss. And now, all that hope was poisoned by the knowledge that someone out there was watching, calculating, and ready to strike again. The more Sasha fixated on it, the more the paranoia grew. She installed security systems, kept Daisy in the same room at night, and refused to leave the house unless Michael or Cody was with her. She stopped answering texts. She stopped accepting visitors. She started journaling every minor change in Daisy's routine. The obsession had become its own form of imprisonment. But still, it didn't stop the internal voice whispering that she had failed as a mother. That she had made a fatal mistake by denying Michael legal paternity. That her need for independence, her pride, had left a door open for a predator to walk through. And then came the guilt that almost broke her. What if this had all been avoidable? What if she hadn't let Willow manipulate her into signing those custody documents? Whispering warnings about how Michael couldn't be trusted with another child while mourning his fractured marriage. Sasha had listened. And now she was suffering for it. She had denied Michael the rights of a father, had excluded him from the birth certificate out of fear and misplaced loyalty to a woman who had grown cold and calculating. In doing so, she had left Daisy vulnerable, not just to emotional instability, but to a monster like Nelle. The worst part was knowing this wasn't just a one-time invasion. This was the beginning of something calculated, something escalating. Sasha's mind began connecting threads she didn't even know she was holding. The strange gift from an unknown sender. The power outage that only affected Daisy's wing of the house. The lullaby that suddenly played from an old toy she hadn't seen in months. Nelle was toying with her, wearing down her defenses, testing the limits of her fear. And the more Sasha obsessed, the more it felt like she was walking into a trap laid with twisted perfection. Every time Sasha looked at Daisy now, she saw both a miracle and a ticking clock. She held her baby longer, watched her while she napped, stared at the hallway through sleepless nights. She kept the curtains drawn and never opened the windows. The baby monitor was upgraded to live feed surveillance. But still, the dread remained. Still, the shadows loomed. Still, the obsession grew. Michael tried to comfort her, but she no longer trusted words. She trusted only what she could see, and even that seemed to warp under the pressure of her spiraling mind. She had gone from survivor to prisoner in her own home, all because the ghost of Nelle refused to stay buried. And the question that haunted her most wasn't whether Nelle would strike again, it was when. Because Sasha knew now, with every breath, that she had stepped into a new kind of war. And this time, It wasn't just her life at stake. It was her daughter's. And if she didn't find a way to outmaneuver Nelle, this resurrected demon cloaked in obsession, revenge, and madness, then Daisy might vanish again, and next time, there might be no trail to follow. And worst of all, Sasha could no longer tell if the obsession belonged to Nelle, or to herself. The chilling realization that Nelle had returned to Port Charles around the same time Michael made his re-entry into the city was more than just a coincidence, it was a calculated, sinister alignment that sent shockwaves through the already fragile foundation of Michael's world. What began as a quiet unease gradually snowballed into a consuming fear. One that infiltrated every aspect of Michael's life and made it impossible for him to ignore the pattern unfolding before his eyes. The timing, the secrecy, the eerie familiarity in recent events, it all pointed to something deliberate, something disturbingly intentional. And it was this revelation that triggered one of the most dangerous psychological shifts Michael had ever experienced. At first, he tried to convince himself that he was imagining things. That the shadows creeping into his home, the inexplicable feeling of being watched, the subtle disruptions around Sasha and Daisy's lives, none of it could truly be linked to Nelle. After all, she was dead. There had been a body, a gravestone, a chapter closed. But the deeper he delved into the timelines, the more impossible it became to deny the truth. Nelle hadn't just survived. She had returned, and she had returned with a plan. What haunted Michael most was not just that Nelle might be alive, but that she had been back all along, hiding in plain sight, watching him. Perhaps even walking the same streets as him, breathing the same air. She had chosen this moment, when he was most vulnerable, rebuilding his life after a brutal custody battle. After heartbreak and betrayal, after losing Willow, to strike with silent precision. It was as if she had waited for the perfect fracture in his armor to drive her way back into his world. And now that realization had ignited something inside him, something volatile. Michael had spent years trying to put his past with Nelle behind him. He had grieved, raged, and moved forward with as much strength as he could muster. But the past wasn't done with him. Nelle had resurfaced like a storm rising from still waters. And she was targeting everything he had rebuilt. Daisy, Sasha, even Wiley. Her methods were no longer overt, they were insidious, psychological, designed to unravel the mind rather than the body. And it was working. The new adjustments Michael had to make were not just practical, they were emotional, mental, soul deep. He could no longer function as a normal man, a father, a partner. Every decision was filtered through the lens of survival, of preemption, of staying one step ahead of someone who had already proven she was capable of anything. He found himself second-guessing everyone. Questioning every glance, every unknown number, every unexplained sound in the night. It wasn't just fear, it was a total shift in his perception of reality. And he was beginning to crack. The people around Michael saw it. Sasha watched as his hands trembled when he picked up Daisy. Brooke Lynn noticed how his voice grew sharper, his tone colder, more erratic. Even Dante, his own brother, began to question whether Michael was imagining threats that didn't exist. But Michael knew. He could feel the change. The tightening noose of something malignant circling back around him. And the more everyone doubted him, the more isolated he became. Just as Nelle would have wanted. This is what made it so dangerous. Michael, once the measured and composed heir to the Corinthos legacy, was now veering dangerously close to obsession himself. He stayed up late poring over old case files, reliving past trauma, trying to find the exact moment Nelle might have reinserted herself into the timeline of Port Charles. He replayed surveillance footage, interviewed hospital staff, even questioned Sasha with increasing urgency about every minute detail of Daisy's care. It wasn't just about protection anymore, it was about proving he wasn't crazy. About showing the world that the monster they all thought was buried had, in fact, clawed her way back. And the scariest part? Nelle hadn't even needed to reveal herself publicly to inflict this level of chaos. Her return alone, silent, unseen, insidious, had been enough to shatter Michael's sense of safety. It had shifted the atmosphere around him, warped it into something toxic and unstable. Michael found himself contemplating things he would never have imagined a year ago. Things like hiring private security. Like confronting his own mother about the choices she made during Nelle's final days. Like wondering if the only way to stop Nelle was to become a version of himself he had sworn never to be. Ruthless, merciless, consumed. One of the most disturbing adjustments now taking root was the growing realization that Michael couldn't protect his daughter, or Sasha, or even himself, without giving in to a darker side. The days of courtrooms and legal victories were over. Nelle didn't play by those rules. She played in the shadows, in whispered threats and mind games. In disappearing pacifiers and manipulated baby monitors. And if Michael wanted to win this battle, he had to embrace the terrifying possibility that the only way out was through her. This was no longer just about a woman returning from the dead. It was about what that return was doing to Michael, how it was dismantling his identity, his morality. His ability to function in a world that now felt treacherous at every turn. Nelle's comeback had forced a terrifying recalibration of his life. He could no longer afford to be Michael the patient. Michael the idealist. Michael the father who trusted the system to protect his children. Now, he was Michael the hunted. Michael the haunted. Michael. On the edge of a transformation that no one could stop, and that Nelle, watching from the shadows, would undoubtedly exploit until the very last moment. Michael had made a mistake, a critical one that, in hindsight, seemed so preventable it bordered on tragic. For all his calculated caution, for all his rehearsed vigilance, he had dismissed the early warnings, brushed off the subtle disturbances, and chosen to believe that the worst of the past had truly stayed buried. But now, as the pieces of the nightmare began to fall into place, there was no denying the truth. Michael's oversight had opened the door to danger, and Daisy, the daughter he swore to protect above all else, had been thrust into the center of a storm that he could no longer contain. There had been signs. Whispered warnings. Quiet unease from Sasha. Flickers of suspicion in the eyes of Lucas and Brooklyn. Even Dante, in a rare moment of hesitation, had voiced concern that something wasn't right. But Michael had waved it all away, too consumed by his need to project control. To hold his fractured world together after the collapse of his relationship with Willow and the slow, emotional unraveling of his own sense of identity. He had ignored the strange occurrences. The baby monitor glitches, the rearranged items in Daisy's room, the unexplained gifts left on the doorstep. He had told himself they were coincidence, anxiety, figments of stress-induced imagination. But they weren't. They were signals. And now, the cost of ignoring them had come due. Daisy had been targeted. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just caught in a dangerous situation, she had become the pawn in someone's sick game. And Michael, with all his resources, all his connections, all his promises to protect her from harm, had failed her. Not out of malice, not out of neglect, but out of arrogance. He had believed that the chaos of his past could be contained by willpower alone. That he could outrun the ghost of Nelle. Compartmentalize the trauma, and raise his daughter in a world scrubbed clean of darkness. But Nelle wasn't gone. And the darkness hadn't receded. It had simply waited. And now, it had returned, not just to haunt Michael, but to punish him. There was a new obsession growing inside him, rooted not in fear but in guilt. The guilt of realizing that every sleepless night, every tear Sasha shed, every tremble in Daisy's tiny frame could be traced back to a moment where Michael chose not to act. Where he convinced himself that the past couldn't claw its way into the present. Where he underestimated the reach of someone like Nelle, someone who thrived on pain, who fed off silence. Who would take everything from him simply because she could. Michael was spiraling, but this time it wasn't because of what others had done to him. It was because of what he hadn't done. The tragedy wasn't just that Daisy had been put in danger, it was that Michael himself had unknowingly cleared the path. He had shut down the idea of increasing security. He had declined Lucas' offer to install new surveillance. He had waved off Sasha's fear when she thought someone had entered the nursery. He had, in essence, chosen denial. And now, that denial had become a weapon turned against his own family. The new adjustments sweeping through his life were no longer optional, they were consequences. Emotional, physical, strategic. He could no longer look Sasha in the eyes without seeing the silent accusation, "You were supposed to keep us safe." And worse. He couldn't look at himself in the mirror without hearing the echo of the truth, "You failed." Daisy's safety had been compromised, not by an outside force alone, but by a father's refusal to see the threat for what it truly was. Michael now lived with the haunting awareness that if something worse had happened, if the timing had been off by mere minutes, if Lucas hadn't intervened, he could have lost her forever. And that knowledge was a poison, corroding every part of his mind, his relationships, his moral compass. This wasn't just a lesson in vigilance. It was a reckoning. Because now, with Nelle's re-emergence all but confirmed, with Sasha teetering on the edge of emotional collapse and the Quartermain household gripped by a new level of dread, Michael understood that the thorns of his mistake would continue to cut deeper. Trust had been shattered. Confidence replaced by paranoia. And the question that loomed over every moment, every breath, was no longer if Daisy was in danger, but when the next blow would strike. Michael's mistake had cost him more than peace of mind. It had cost him the ability to pretend. To believe in safety. To move through his world without fear. And now, he was left with only two choices: surrender to the guilt or use it as fuel for a transformation so complete that even Nelle wouldn't see it coming. But the cost of that transformation, of becoming someone unrecognizable, someone forged in guilt and fear, might be the last piece of himself that he has left to lose. Michael was no longer the man who had stood in courtrooms and boardrooms with unwavering resolve. He had changed. And that change had been ignited by the single truth he could no longer ignore: Daisy. His daughter was not safe, and it was his responsibility to make sure she would be. The recent chaos had forced Michael into an emotional and psychological recalibration. A desperate need to take back control, to undo the damage, and to face the demons that had slipped through the cracks of his carefully managed world. Now, everything he did was motivated by one goal: saving Daisy. And the deeper he went, the more terrifying the truths he uncovered. What began as a quiet suspicion had erupted into a full-scale crisis. Sasha's anxiety, once brushed off as postpartum paranoia, was now validated by undeniable facts. Someone had infiltrated the Quartermain estate. Someone had tampered with Daisy's surroundings. And that someone had left behind traces of something much darker, a signature of manipulation and obsession. The evidence pointed to Nelle. And with that possibility came the horrifying realization that the nightmare wasn't new. It had been unfolding quietly, calculatedly, beneath the surface for weeks, perhaps months. Michael's actions became frantic, every decision born out of fear and guilt. He doubled the security around Daisy. He moved her into a different room and refused to let anyone else care for her besides Sasha, Lucas, or himself. He tore through old case files. Tried to retrace every possible connection between Nelle and the people in his orbit. He grilled Sunny, demanded answers from Jason. And pushed Willow away entirely, unwilling to let her proximity blur the lines of what had to be done. This wasn't just about keeping Daisy safe anymore. It was about justice, retribution, and survival. Then came the confrontation. It happened late one night in the garden behind the estate, where the shadows cast by the trees seemed to stretch toward the truth itself. Michael saw her, standing beneath the moonlight as if she'd never left. Nelle. Alive. Unchanged. Unapologetic. The last time he saw her, she was falling off a cliff. Now, she stood tall, taunting him with the smirk of someone who had already won half the war. Their eyes locked, and the years of anger, betrayal, and unresolved torment surged to the surface. Michael didn't speak at first. He simply stared, as if convincing himself she was real. But Nelle had no time for sentiment. She wanted chaos. She thrived on it. You didn't protect her, she said with a calmness that sent a chill through his bones. You let her live in a house where ghosts walk freely. Just like you let me fall. Just like you let Wiley be taken from me. Michael lunged, not with violence, but with rage born from every sleepless night he'd endured since learning she might be alive. The argument escalated quickly, accusations flung like knives. Secrets unraveling between their words. Nelle revealed she'd been watching them for months, ever since Michael returned to Port Charles. She had been waiting for the right time. The perfect fracture in the family armor, and when Willow collapsed and Michael lost custody, she slipped in unnoticed, blending with the shadows of resentment and fear. She admitted to switching Daisy's clothes. She confessed to sneaking into her room just to prove a point, that no matter how powerful or privileged Michael thought he was, he couldn't protect what mattered most. That confession hit harder than any blow could. And worse, Nelle implied she wasn't working alone. There were whispers of Sidwell. Of others. Of a network willing to burn everything Michael loved just to watch him suffer. As the confrontation ended and Nelle vanished into the night once more, Michael was left with a new version of himself, haunted, changed, determined. The adjustments he had to make were no longer just logistical, they were fundamental. He could no longer pretend to be the calm father, the stable force of the Corinthos legacy. He had to become something else entirely. Someone who would do anything, cross any line. To keep Daisy safe and to bring Nelle down. The secrets they shared now, about Daisy, about Sasha, about Nina, about the past, were enough to tear Port Charles apart. And Michael knew the worst was yet to come. Because now he wasn't just protecting a child. He was bracing for war. A war with someone who had already died once and come back more dangerous than ever. A war where the rules were shattered, and the consequences would echo through every corner of the lives he was trying so desperately to hold together.